the moment George Carson's horse crested the ridge above Caldwell, Kansas, and he saw the water tower still standing with the word Caldwell painted in faded white letters against the afternoon sky of September 1883, something cracked open in his chest that he had spent 2 years trying to seal shut. He had not meant to come back. He had told himself, on 100 different nights under 100 different skies, that he was done with this town and everything it held. He had told himself that in Abilene, where he had spent 3 months working cattle drives for a rancher named Hollies who paid fair and asked no questions. He had told himself that in Dodge City, where the saloons ran loud until past midnight and a man could lose himself in the noise if he tried hard enough. He had told himself that in the wide, empty stretches of the Oklahoma Territory, where he had ridden alone for weeks at a time, speaking to no one except his horse, a bay gelding he called Samson, and the God he was not sure was still listening. 2 years was a long time to be gone. 2 years was long enough for a man to change, or to think he had changed, or to discover that some parts of him refused to change no matter how many miles he put between himself and the thing that had broken him open. The thing that had broken him open was not a thing at all. It was a person. It was Elsie Donnelly. He had first known Elsie when she was 19 and he was 22, back in the spring of 1881, when Caldwell was booming from the cattle trade and the streets were loud with drovers and merchants, and the occasional gunshot that meant someone had taken the evening's card game too seriously. Elsie had come to Caldwell with her father, Patrick Donnelly, a man who had scraped enough money together in Missouri to buy a dry goods store on the main street, and who had brought his daughter west because he had no other family to leave her with and no inclination to leave her behind. George had been working for the Caldwell stockyards then, keeping records of the cattle that moved through, a job that suited him because he was meticulous and honest and better with numbers than most men in town. He had met Elsie for the first time when she came into the stockyards office to deliver a message from her father to the yard's foreman, and she had walked through the door with dust on her boots and an expression on her face that suggested she found the smell of the place considerably less appealing than she was letting on. And George had looked up from his ledger and thought, without quite meaning to, that she was the most straightforward and quietly beautiful person he had ever laid eyes on. She had brown hair the color of good saddle leather and green eyes that were quick and sharp and missed nothing. She was not the kind of beautiful that made men stupid on sight. She was the kind of beautiful that crept up on a person, that revealed itself in layers, so that after knowing her for a week a man would suddenly realize he had been thinking about her without noticing, and after knowing her for a month he would understand that something serious had happened to him. George had known her for 3 months before he admitted to himself that he was in love with her, and by that time she had already come to occupy so much of his thinking that the admission felt less like a discovery and more like a confirmation of something he had been circling for a long time. They had spent those 3 months doing the ordinary things that people did in a cattle town in 1881. He had helped her father move a shipment of flour sacks when the delivery man had injured his hand. She had brought George a slice of apple pie that her father's housekeeper had made, setting it on his desk at the stockyards office with a businesslike efficiency that made him smile for the rest of the afternoon. He had walked her home from the church social in June when her father had been delayed by a conversation with the town's minister. She had told him about growing up in Missouri, about her mother who had died of fever when Elsie was 12, about how she had learned to keep house and keep accounts and keep her own counsel because her father, whom she loved fiercely, was a man who needed someone practical beside him. George had told her things too, things he did not usually tell people. That he had grown up in Texas, that his father had died in the war when George was 8, and his mother had remarried a man who was not cruel but who was indifferent, which had its own particular kind of damage. That he had learned to read well and figure numbers from a schoolteacher in a small town near San Antonio who had recognized something in him and pushed accordingly. that he had come to Kansas because the cattle trade was where the work was, and the work was what a man needed to make something of himself. By the end of summer in 1881, George Carson and Elsie Donnelly had become something that Caldwell recognized even before they had fully recognized it themselves. They were becoming a pair. They were becoming the kind of two people who moved through a room and unconsciously oriented toward each other, who laughed at the same things and argued about others with the easy comfort of people who trust each other enough to disagree. And then everything had gone wrong. Patrick Donnelly had debts that George had not known about. Debts owed to a man named Harlan Voss, who had arrived in Caldwell in August of 1881, with money made from land speculation, and a personality that reminded George of a snake that had learned to wear a frock coat. Harlan Voss was 43 years old, already twice widowed, and he had decided that Elsie Donnelly would make an excellent third wife. He had made this known to Patrick Donnelly in terms that were courteous on the surface and threatening underneath, suggesting that the forgiveness of certain debts might be connected to certain domestic arrangements. George had learned about this from Elsie herself, one evening in September of 1881, when they had been sitting on the bench outside the dry goods store, and she had told him in a flat, controlled voice that her father was considering Harlan Voss's proposal. Her hands were folded in her lap with a stillness that George had already learned meant she was working to keep herself from showing how much something had upset her. George had done something reckless then. He had told her he would speak to her father. He had told her that no man who cared about her could allow that arrangement to proceed. He had spoken to Patrick Donnelly that same evening, and it had not gone well. Patrick Donnelly was a fundamentally decent man who was in a desperate situation, and George Carson was a stockyards clerk who made $30 a month and had no land, no savings worth mentioning, and no established future. Patrick Donnelly had not been unkind about it. He had simply explained, with the exhausted patience of a man who had already run the numbers too many times, that he could not afford sentiment. What followed had been the worst 3 months of George's life. He had watched Elsie be courted by Harlan Voss with a courtliness that set George's teeth on edge. He had watched her sit through Sunday dinners at Voss's house, which was the finest house in Caldwell, and come out afterwards with that same controlled stillness on her face. He had spoken to her whenever he could, in stolen moments between her father's watchful presence and Voss's possessive attention, and she had told him quietly that she did not know what to do, that she was afraid of what would happen to her father if she refused, that she did not want this but could not see a clear way out of it. George had tried to find a way out for her. He had gone to the town's lawyer, a man named Beaumont, who had listened sympathetically and explained that the law offered Elsie and her father very little protection in this situation. He had tried to raise money, working extra hours, selling his second horse, but $30 a month added slowly, and the debts her father owed were substantial. He had even considered going to Voss directly, but Voss had looked at him once across the main street with a cold amusement that made clear he had already assessed George Carson and found him to be of no consequence. Then, in December of 1881, something had happened that George had not anticipated. Elsie's father had accepted Voss's proposal on Elsie's behalf, and Elsie, faced with her father's relief and her own inability to find another solution, had agreed to the engagement. She had told George in a brief and painful conversation outside the dry goods store on a cold morning with snow just beginning to settle on the boardwalk, and her voice had been steady and her eyes had not been, and she had said, "I am sorry, George. I do not see another way." George had stood there for a long moment, and then he had said something that he had regretted every single day for 2 years afterward. He had said, "Then I cannot stay here and watch this." And he had meant it as an expression of pain, as the kind of thing a wounded man says when he does not have the words for what he is actually feeling. But it had come out sounding like abandonment. It had come out sounding like he was choosing to leave rather than choosing to fight. He had left Caldwell in January of 1882, in the bitter cold of a Kansas winter, riding Sampson north toward Abilene, telling himself that there was nothing left for him here, that she had made her choice, that the kindest thing he could do for himself and perhaps for her was to go. For 2 years, he had almost believed it. But news had a way of traveling in the cattle country, carried on the lips of drovers and merchants, and the occasional letter that found a man even when he had not given anyone an address. In May of 1883, a drover named Clem who had worked in Caldwell the previous year had told George, while they were loading cattle in Abilene, that Harlan Voss had died the previous winter. A heart ailment, Clem said. Sudden and complete in the night, and nobody in Caldwell had seemed overly grieved about it, including, Clem added with a particular look at George, the widow. George had said nothing to Clem. He had finished loading the cattle, and he had walked back to the rooming house where he was staying, and he had sat on the edge of his bed, and thought about Elsie Donnelly being a widow in Caldwell, Kansas. And he had felt a complicated constellation of things that included relief and sorrow for what she had endured, and something he could not name that was neither of those. He had not ridden for Caldwell immediately. He had spent 4 more months telling himself that she would not want him back, that he had left, that she had spent a year and some months married to a man she had not loved, because George Carson had not been able to do anything useful except leave. He had spent those 4 months doing penance in the form of hard work and long silences, until one morning in September of 1883 he had woken up before dawn in his bunk in Abilene, and known with a sudden and complete certainty that he was going to ride to Caldwell, not because he deserved anything, not because he expected anything, but because 2 years of distance had not changed the fundamental fact that Elsie Donnelly was the person he thought about when he thought about a future worth having. He had saddled Sampson before the sun was fully up, and he had ridden south. Now he sat on the ridge above Caldwell, looking down at the town in the September afternoon light, and Sampson shifted beneath him as if sensing the uncertainty in his rider. "All right," George said quietly, to the horse and to himself and perhaps to the wide Kansas sky above him. "All right." He rode down into town. Caldwell in September of 1883 was a town that had seen its best cattle years and knew it, but had not quite resigned itself to that knowledge. The streets were still busy, still loud with the commerce of a town that sat near the border of the Indian Territory and served as a waypoint for enough trade to keep it breathing. The main street had the same saloons, the same general stores, the same land office and lawyer's office, and the Caldwell Courier printing shop that George remembered. But there were new buildings too, a second bank and what looked like a proper hotel where there had been only a boarding house, and the water tower that had been half built when he left was now complete. He rode Sampson down the main street at a walk, keeping his hat brim low not from any shame exactly, but from the particular caution of a man who does not know what reception to expect. A few people looked at him in the way that people in a small town look at someone who has been away a long time, with that half-recognition that slides toward certainty. He saw old Tom Withers outside the feed store, a man who had been old when George left and appeared to have decided to remain at the same age rather than proceed further. Tom looked at George for a long moment, then gave a single nod, which George returned. He did not know where Elsie was. He did not know if she was still in Caldwell at all, though Clem's news had implied it. He pulled Sampson up in front of the livery stable and dismounted, handing the horse over to the stable boy with instructions for feed and water, and then he stood on the street and considered his next move. The dry goods store was still there. He could see it from where he stood. The sign above the door read Donnelly's Dry Goods in the same painted letters he remembered, though they had been freshened at some point, the paint not as faded as he would have expected. Patrick Donnelly was either still alive and still in business, or Elsie had kept the place running herself. George straightened his coat, which was trail dusty and not particularly impressive, and walked toward the store. The bell above the door made the same sound it always had, a bright single note, when he pushed it open. The store smelled of sawdust and cloth and the particular dry sweetness of bulk grain in sacks. The shelves were well stocked and neatly organized, which was as he remembered it. Elsie had always had strong opinions about the organization of the shelves. There was a woman behind the counter with her back to him, reaching up to place something on a high shelf. She was wearing a dark blue dress and her brown hair was pinned up, and George's heart performed a motion that he could not have described accurately, something between a lurch and a stop. She turned around. Elsie Donnelly looked at him across the length of the store, and for a moment neither of them moved. She was 21 years old now. She had been 19 when he first met her, and the 2 years had not aged her so much as settled her, the way good wood settles into itself and becomes more solidly what it was always meant to be. She was still the same person he remembered, but more precisely herself. The sharpness in her green eyes was still there, and so was the particular economy of her expressions, the way she never wasted a reaction. The reaction she was having now was not small. He could see that even across the room. "George Carson," she said. Her voice was even. Her hands resting on the counter were very still. "Elsie," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I heard that Voss had passed." He did, in February. She did not move toward him or away from him. "You heard all the way and wherever you were." "Abilene. A drover named Clem told me." "Clem Barker, he talks." She said it without heat. Her eyes were moving over his face with the careful attention of someone reading a document and not wanting to miss anything. "You look like you have been riding a long time." "A few days," he said. "I came from Abilene. That is 4 days' ride. 3 if you push." A silence stretched between them that was not comfortable but was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who have said too many things to each other and left too many other things unsaid, and who are standing in the middle of all of it trying to find their footing. "My father is in back," Elsie said finally. "He has not been well. His heart, the doctor says. He has been resting more." "I am sorry to hear that. He would want to see you, I think." She paused. "He always liked you, even when he did what he did." George looked at her steadily. "I did not come to see your father, Elsie." The color in her cheeks shifted, not quite a blush, but something close. "I know why you came." "Do you?" "I am not a fool, George Carson, and I was never one even when the people around me behaved as though I was." The sharpness in her voice was not anger, it was something more complicated. "You left." "I did. You said you could not stay and watch." "I know what I said." "And then you did not write, not once in 2 years." He did not have a good answer for that, so he gave her the honest one. "No, I did not write. I told myself 100 different reasons for it, and they were all cowardly. I am sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind the counter, her hands moved slightly, a small adjustment. Then she said in a different voice, one that was quieter and had something raw at the edges, "I did not know if you would ever come back." "I almost did not," he said. "I went back and forth about it for 4 months after I heard." "And what decided you?" He looked at her across the store, in the afternoon light that came through the front window and caught the dust motes in the air and made everything look a little like a painting. "I could not think of a future that made sense without you in it," he said. "That has been true for 2 years. I just had to stop being a coward long enough to do something about it." Elsie Donnelly did something then that surprised him. She laughed. Not a polite or social laugh, but a real one, short and a little helpless. The kind of laugh that comes out when a person has been holding something taut for too long and it suddenly gives way. "You absolute fool," she said, but she was still almost laughing, and the sharpness in her eyes had changed into something else entirely. "You absolute, infuriating fool." "I know," he said. "I know that." She came around the counter then, which he had not expected, and she walked toward him with the directness that he remembered and had missed more than he could account for, and she stopped an arm's length away and looked up at him. "You look terrible," she said. "Trail dust and 3 days' growth, and your coat has seen better years." "I rode hard." "I can see that." She reached up, not quite touching him, and then thought better of it, and her hand dropped back to her side. You will need a room. Mrs. Hale's boarding house is still running, you remember it. I remember it. And you will want a meal. The cafe on the East End is decent now. A woman named Clara Prout runs it. She came to Caldwell last year. Elsie. What? I did not come back for the boarding house or the cafe. I know that. Her voice had gone quiet again. I know that very well, George, but we have 2 years between us that need to be gotten through. You cannot just ride back in here and have everything be simple. I'm not expecting simple, he said. I'm expecting to have to work for it. I'm prepared to work for it. I just needed to know that there was something left to work for. She looked at him for a long and searching moment, and then she said with a careful honesty that cost her something, "There is something left to work for. But I need you to understand that things are not the same as they were. I am not the same. I have had experiences that changed me, George, and if you are going to be here you have to understand that." "I want to understand it," he said. "I want to understand all of it, if you will let me." She nodded once, a small and decisive motion. "Get yourself settled at Mrs. Hale's, clean up, come back here at 6 o'clock and we will close the store together and you can take me to supper at Clara's cafe and we will talk." "All right," he said. "And George." "Yes. Do not leave again." She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said everything that mattered. "I do not mean forever. I do not mean anything extravagant. I just mean if you are here, be here. If you are going to go, tell me before you go. I am done with people making decisions that involve me without telling me." "I will tell you," he said. "I swear that to you, Elsie. I will tell you." She held his gaze for another moment, and then she went back around the counter in her businesslike way, and George Carson walked out of the store into the September afternoon with the curious feeling of a man who has been holding his breath for 2 years and has just, very tentatively, begun to let it go. Mrs. Hale's boarding house was on the north end of the main street, a 2-story wooden building painted white that was beginning to gray at the edges but remained tidy and respectable. Mrs. Hale herself was a compact, efficient woman of about 50 who had the memory of an elephant and the discretion of a judge, which were exactly the qualities a boarding house operator in a cattle town needed. She recognized George immediately and gave him the second room on the upper floor with a window that faced west, which meant good light in the afternoons. George cleaned up with the basin of water Mrs. Hale brought, changed into his less dusty shirt, and went to see about stabling Samson properly at the livery, negotiating a reasonable weekly rate with the stable master, a big, slow-talking man named Ike, who seemed to have no strong opinions about anything except horses, whom he regarded with a dedicated professionalism. By the time George returned to the boarding house and sat in the small chair by his window with an hour to spare before 6 o'clock, the town was settling into its late afternoon rhythms. He could hear the main street below, the clop of horses, the distant conversation of men on the boardwalk, the occasional sound from the nearer of the 2 saloons. It was all the same and not the same, the way things always were when you went back somewhere after an absence. He thought about what Elsie had said. Things are not the same. She had been 19 when she agreed to a marriage she had not wanted, with a man she had not loved, because she had seen no other choice, and because the person who should have found her another choice had ridden north to Abilene instead. And then she had been married to Harlan Voss for something like a year, perhaps a little more, before he died. George did not know what that had been like. He suspected it had not been good. Voss had been the kind of man who owned things, who regarded his possessions with the same cool attention he gave his business interests, and a wife would have been no different to him. The thought of it made something quiet and angry move through George, but he pushed it aside because the anger was not useful and was, besides, directed in some part at himself. At 6 o'clock he walked back down the main street to Donnelly's dry goods. Through the front window he could see the lamplight inside, and when he pushed the door open Elsie was putting on her coat, a dark wool coat that was practical rather than fashionable, and turning the lamp down. Her father was standing near the back doorway that led to the living quarters behind the store, a thin man with gray hair and a face that had aged considerably in 2 years. Patrick Donnelly looked at George with an expression that contained several things at once: recognition, something that might have been guilt, and a careful hope. "George Carson," Patrick said, "back in Caldwell." "Mr. Donnelly," George said. "Good to see you, sir. I was sorry to hear you have not been well." Patrick waved a thin hand. "I am managed. Elsie manages everything." He looked at his daughter with a complicated love. "She always did, even when I made it harder for her than it should have been." He looked back at George. "I am glad you came back." George did not know exactly what to say to that, so he said, "Thank you, sir." Elsie touched her father's arm. "I will be back by 8, Papa. There is stew on the stove." "I can feed myself," Patrick said, with the dignity of a man who knows he is being taken care of and is grateful for it even when he protests. The September evening was cool and clear, the kind of evening that made Kansas feel like the whole sky was an open invitation. George and Elsie walked side by side down the boardwalk toward the east end of town, and for the first block neither of them spoke, and the silence was a bit like the space between a lightning flash and the thunder, full of accumulated charge. Clara Pruitt's cafe was warm and smelled of coffee and roasting meat and fresh bread. Clara herself was a round-faced woman of about 40 with red-gray hair and an air of competent hospitality, and she seated them at a corner table with the efficiency of someone who was very good at her work and knew it. The cafe had perhaps a dozen tables, and most of them were occupied. Men from the cattle operations mostly, a few families, a couple of merchants who George recognized vaguely. They ordered venison stew with biscuits and coffee, and when Clara went away they were left with the candle on the table and the noise of the cafe around them and the 2 years between them. "Tell me," George said quietly, "what it was like, if you want to tell me." Elsie wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, which had arrived quickly, and considered. "It was not violent," she said carefully. "I want you to know that first, because I know it is the thing that would most concern you. Harlan Voss did not hit me or treat me roughly. He was," she paused, "cold, very precise about what he expected and what a wife was for. He was not interested in conversation. He was not interested in who I was as a person. I was there to manage his household and to appear correctly at social functions and to be available when he required it." She said the last part without embarrassment and without looking away from her coffee cup. "It was like living as furniture that occasionally had to move on its own." George absorbed this carefully. "And you managed." "I have always managed," she said. "It is what I do. I kept his house excellently. I learned very quickly what he expected, and I delivered it with perfect precision and not 1 degree more than that, because I found that if I gave him more than the minimum he required, he simply required more. So I kept it at the minimum and he had no complaint." She finally looked up. "I was lonely," she said. "That is the truth of it. Lonely in the way that is worse than regular loneliness, because you are surrounded by things and people and none of them are real company." "Elsie," he said. "Do not," she said, but not harshly. "Do not apologize again, George. You already apologized and I heard it and I accept it. What I am doing now is telling you, which is what you asked me to do. I'm not telling you so that you will feel guilty. I am telling you because you said you wanted to understand. I do want to understand. Then understand this. I survived it because I am who I am, because I have a father to take care of and a store to help run and a mind that does not stop working just because its circumstances are difficult. I survived it, and when Harlan died in February I felt," she stopped, and something honest moved through her expression, "I felt free, genuinely free. For the first time in more than a year. And I was ashamed of that for about 2 weeks, and then I stopped being ashamed of it because it was the true feeling, and I have learned not to spend energy on untrue feelings." George looked at her in the candlelight. She was, he thought, one of the strongest people he had ever known, and the strength was not the loud kind, not the kind that announced itself. It was the quiet, structural kind, the kind that holds things up from the inside. "What did you do after?" he asked. "I came back," she said simply. Harlan's estate went to a cousin in St. Louis, which was as it should be. We had no children and the property was his from before. I had my widow's portion, which was modest but sufficient, and I came back to Papa's store and started helping him run it again. His health had been declining for the last months of my marriage, and I had not been able to help him much from across town with Harlan's expectations. So I came back. She glanced down at her coffee again. I have been running the store mostly on my own since March. Papa can do the lighter work, but the lifting and the ledgers and the suppliers are mine. The store looks well, George said. Better than I remember it, honestly. A small, real smile touched her mouth. I reorganized the back stock and negotiated better rates with 2 of the suppliers. And I got Papa's debt to the bank down by half. She said it matter-of-factly, not bragging. It is not so different from running a household. It is just arithmetic and consistency. It is more than that, George said, and you know it. She looked at him with the sharp, assessing look he had missed so much without knowing how specifically he missed it. You always did that, she said. Did what? Told me that what I was doing was more than I was giving it credit for. When I talked about keeping my father's books, you said it was real accounting. When I organized the store's stock system, you said it was inventory management, and that most businesses would pay a man good money to do it. She shook her head slightly. Most people just nodded and moved on. Most people were not paying attention, he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then the food arrived and they spent a few minutes settling into it. The stew was excellent, and George, who had been eating trail food for 3 days, found it remarkable in the way that only good cooking after a long absence can be remarkable. Tell me about the 2 years, Elsie said after a while. I told you mine, tell me yours. So he told her. He told her about Abilene, about the rancher Hollies who had been decent to work for, about the cattle drives along the Kishom Trail, about Dodge City and its particular wildness, and the way he had never quite been able to lose himself in it the way some men did. He told her about the months in the Oklahoma Territory, about the loneliness of wide open spaces that is entirely different from the loneliness of crowds, cleaner somehow but no less present. He told her about the drover Clem and the February night in Abilene which had happened in the spring, when he had first heard about Voss's death and sat in his boarding room and felt the world rearrange itself around a single piece of information. I should have come sooner, he said. You came when you came, she said. People do things in the order that they do them. I'm not interested in should-haves. You are very direct. I am very tired of indirect, she said. 2 years of marriage to a man who communicated exclusively in implications and expectations will do that to a person. She set down her spoon. I have decided that I prefer things to be said plainly. If I want something, I will say so. If I do not want something, I will also say so. I find it is much more efficient. George studied her face in the warm light of the cafe. She had always been direct. It was one of the first things he had loved about her, but there was a new precision to it now, a deliberateness that had come, he understood, from experience, from learning that indirectness was a luxury she could not afford. Then I will be direct too, he said. I came back because I am still in love with you. I have been in love with you for 2 years despite all the miles and all the convincing myself otherwise. I am not going to pretend I deserve anything from you or that you owe me anything, but I would like to stay in Caldwell and I would like to court you properly if you will allow it. Elsie looked at him steadily. The cafe went on around them, the clatter and conversation of other people's evenings. You will need work, she said. You cannot live on what you have saved from cattle driving forever. What kind of work are you thinking? It was such a practical response to a declaration of love that George almost laughed. Almost. Because he understood it was not a deflection. It was her way of saying yes, of saying tell me how this is actually going to work, which was a more serious engagement with the future than a simple romantic acceptance would have been. I have been thinking about that, he said. I kept books for 3 different cattle operations over 2 years. I know stockyard operations better than most. If the Caldwell yards still need a records man, I would apply there. Or there may be other businesses in town that need someone reliable with numbers. Beaumont the lawyer is looking for a clerk, she said immediately. He mentioned it to Papa last week. He is getting older and his handwriting is not as good as it was, and he needs someone who can manage correspondence and keep his files in order. It would be steady work and respectable. George blinked at her. You were already thinking about this. The color in her cheeks shifted again. I was considering the possibilities, she said, with great dignity. In case you had, in fact, actually come back, which I did not know for certain until you walked through my door today. You were considering the possibilities, he repeated, and now he did smile. He could not help it. It is what I do, she said, and the composure around her eyes broke just slightly. And for a moment she was smiling too, and they were both smiling across a table in Clara Pruitt's cafe on a September evening in Caldwell, Kansas, with 2 years of damage and distance behind them, and something new and careful and very real beginning to lean toward the light. The following weeks were the kind that are built from small things and are nonetheless extraordinary. George went to see Beaumont the lawyer the morning after his supper with Elsie, and found him to be a thin, methodical man of 62 who cared enormously about precise language and despaired quietly and continuously about his own deteriorating penmanship. George's handwriting was clear and consistent, and after 15 minutes of conversation and a brief demonstration, Beaumont offered him the position. It was not large money, $25 a month to begin, with the expectation of $28 if he proved reliable over 3 months. It was enough. It was a start. He settled into Mrs. Hale's boarding house with the intention of finding something more permanent when his finances allowed. He spent his workdays in Beaumont's office, organizing files that had not been organized in some time, transcribing correspondence, and learning the particular rhythms of a small-town law practice that dealt primarily with land disputes, estate matters, and the occasional contract. He found he liked the work. There was a satisfaction to legal documents that appealed to the same part of him that had always liked ledgers, the sense that words properly arranged had power and permanence. Every evening, unless rain made it impractical, he went to Donnelly's dry goods at closing time. Sometimes he helped move stock. Sometimes he sat with Patrick Donnelly in the back room and talked while Elsie counted the day's take and entered it in the ledger, the scratch of her pen a background sound that he found inexplicably comforting. On Sundays after church, he and Elsie walked together, sometimes east along the creek that ran behind the town's south end, sometimes west toward the open prairie where the land went on until your eyes got tired of trying to find the end of it. They talked. They talked about everything and nothing, about the store and Beaumont's cases, and the news that came in from the wider world through the Caldwell Courier, about the politics of the cattle trade, and what the coming of the railroad further north was doing to the trail drive business. They talked about small things, the best way to keep ledger ink from smearing in hot weather, whether Clara Pruitt's apple pie was better than her peach, which of the 2 horses in the livery that looked like they had opinions about their neighbors was right about it. They talked about larger things too, carefully and by degrees, the way people do when they are rebuilding trust in the places where it was worn through. In October, on a Sunday that had turned unexpectedly warm, they had walked further west than usual and found themselves sitting on a low rise above the prairie with the grass gone golden and the sky immense and blue above them. And Elsie had said, without particular preamble, I want to tell you something about the marriage, something specific. Then tell me, he said. I want to tell you that it was very nearly on 2 or 3 occasions something I could not get through, not because of anything violent or dramatic, because of the particular grinding quality of being unseen. There were mornings when I woke up and thought about who I was before I entered that house, and the distance between that person and who I was at that moment felt very large and very dark. She was looking at the prairie, not at him. I want you to know that because I want you to understand that I know the difference now, between being unseen and being seen. And you, she stopped. Me, he said gently. You always saw me, she said. You always saw what I was actually doing and what I was actually thinking, almost from the first. It used to make me self-conscious. I am not as self-conscious about it now." She finally turned to look at him. "I want you to keep doing that, not because I need to be admired, because I need to not be invisible." He looked at her in the warm October light. "You could not be invisible if you tried," he said, "and I would not look away even if you could." She reached over and put her hand on his, very briefly, and then took it back. But it had happened, and they both knew it had happened, and the afternoon felt different after that. At the end of October, George asked her if he might take her to the harvest dance that the town held every year at the Grange Hall. He asked her as they were walking back from the creek on a Sunday, phrasing it with the kind of careful formality that he applied to the request because he understood it mattered. It was public. It was a statement. She said yes, with that particular directness that was entirely hers, and the harvest dance on the last Friday of October was the first time they danced together, in the warm lamplight of the Grange Hall, with the fiddle player sawing out a reel and the whole community of Caldwell around them. George was not a graceful dancer. He was adequate, but Elsie was light on her feet and patient with him, and they danced 3 dances and then stood at the side with cups of punch and watched the other couples and talked about nothing in particular, and it was, George thought, one of the finest evenings of his life. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. Caldwell was not a large place, and its residents had the practiced attentiveness of people who live close to each other and have nothing much to hide from. There was talk, the kind that happens in dry goods stores and at the barbers and in the corners of the Sunday church. Some of it was warm, and some of it was the speculative variety that any widow who begins to be seen publicly with a man would attract. Mrs. Hale mentioned to George, with the careful delicacy of a woman who wanted to be helpful without being intrusive, that Caldwell generally thought well of the situation, though there were some who felt that Elsie Donnelly had had enough trouble and deserved better than a man who had left her once already. George received this information the way he felt he deserved to receive it. He did not argue with it. He understood it. All he could do was demonstrate day by day that he was here and intended to remain here, and let the demonstration speak for itself. In November, Patrick Donnelly had a difficult week. His heart, already unreliable, gave him 2 days of pain and breathlessness that kept him to his bed and frightened Elsie considerably, though she managed the fear in her usual manner, by channeling it directly into action. She ran the store herself those 2 days and kept the household running and sat with her father in the evenings, and when George offered to come and help with whatever might need doing, she let him, which felt like a significant trust. He spent 2 evenings in the back room of the Donnelly household, doing small practical things, bringing firewood from the stack outside, heating the water that Elsie needed for her father's comfort, sitting with Patrick when Elsie needed to sleep for a few hours. Patrick Donnelly, propped in his bed with pillows and wrapped in quilts, talked to George in a low and somewhat wheezy voice about Missouri, about the early years of the dry goods business, about Elsie's mother, whom he had loved deeply and still missed. He also talked once about Harlan Voss and what he had done, and he said, with a plainness that surprised George, "I know I did wrong by her. I know it every day. I told myself I had no choice, and maybe I did not, but there are ways of having no choice and ways of having no choice, and I took the coward's way. I traded my daughter's happiness for my own peace of mind. I am sorry for it." "She has not told me that she holds it against you," George said carefully. "She would not," Patrick said. "She is better than I am. She always was." He was quiet for a moment. "You came back." "I did." "Good." Patrick looked at him with old eyes that were still sharp. "Do not leave again." "I told her I would not," George said. "I intend to keep that." Patrick nodded once, with a finality that suggested the matter was settled to his satisfaction, and then closed his eyes, and George sat in the quiet room listening to the older man breathe, and to the sound of Elsie moving about in the kitchen, the small domestic sounds of someone who was tired but still attending to things, and felt the strange and warming sensation of a life beginning to take its proper shape. Patrick recovered sufficiently over the following week to resume his lighter duties at the store. The doctor, a competent young man from Ohio named Dr. Hargrove, who had come to Caldwell the previous year, confirmed that the heart was weak and likely to remain so, that Patrick should not lift anything heavy or exert himself too strenuously, but that with care and rest he might go on for some years yet. Elsie heard this and organized her father's routine accordingly, with the systematic efficiency that she applied to everything, and George, watching her do it, thought that Beaumont's law practice was frankly underutilizing the capacity of Caldwell's most capable administrator. He said this to Elsie one evening in November when they were sitting in the back room of the store after closing, a thing that had become a comfortable habit, Elsie working on her ledgers, George reading the newspaper or occasionally helping with the correspondence that suppliers sent. She looked up from her ledger and gave him the look she had for his observations of this kind. "What would you have me do instead?" she said. "The store is Papa's livelihood and mine." "I would not have you do anything else," he said. "I am only saying you could do anything else if you chose to. That is different." She considered this. "I know," she said. "I have thought about it sometimes. I am good at figures and organizing, better than most men I have known who are paid to be good at it." She said it without bitterness or vanity, simply as a factual observation. "But the store is here and Papa needs it, and I am not going to leave it for some theoretical opportunity." "No," he agreed, "but you might expand it." She looked at him more carefully. "What do you mean? You mentioned last week that the nearest millinery is in Wichita. Women in Caldwell have to send away for hats or do without. And you said that the widow Carmichael sews exceptionally well and is looking for additional income." He folded the newspaper in his lap. "I am only thinking aloud." Elsie was quiet for a moment, and then she picked up her pen and started writing in the margin of her ledger. He recognized the motion. She was making notes. He hid his smile in the newspaper. By December, they were in love in the way that has been earned rather than simply arrived at, the kind that has been tested before it has finished developing and is therefore stronger in its structure than the kind that has not. They both knew it, and they moved through it with the careful attention of people who understand that something valuable needs to be handled with intelligence as well as feeling. George kissed her for the first time on a December evening when they were walking back from Clara's cafe, in the cold dark of the main street with a dusting of snow just beginning to fall. He stopped walking, and she stopped a step later and turned back to look at him, and something in his face must have said what he was intending because she did not move away. He kissed her gently and briefly, and then slightly less briefly, and when they separated the snow was falling around them and she was looking at him with an expression that was entirely new, open and warm in a way he had not seen before, like a room with the windows thrown wide. "I wondered when you were going to do that," she said. "Since October," he admitted, "at least." "I know," she said. "I was waiting patiently," and she tucked her arm through his and they walked on through the snow, and the cold did not feel cold at all. Christmas in Caldwell in 1883 was a quiet and pleasant affair. George spent Christmas dinner at the Donnellys, which Patrick had insisted upon and Elsie had endorsed with a warmth that she expressed, as she expressed most things, through actions rather than declarations. She cooked, and it was a considerable undertaking, roast chicken and potatoes, and a bread pudding with dried fruit that George declared the best he had ever eaten, and she dismissed this compliment with a practical efficiency that suggested she was nonetheless pleased by it. After dinner, Patrick dozed by the fire and George sat with Elsie at the kitchen table, and she showed him the notebook she had been keeping since November, in which she had worked out a plan for adding a small millinery and sewing section to the store. It was thorough and detailed and included a projected cost analysis and estimated revenue figures based on what she knew of Caldwell's female population and their likely spending patterns. George read through it carefully. "This is very good, Elsie," he said. "I know," she said, and then, "I want to do it. I have been thinking about it for weeks, and I believe it is feasible, and I want to do it. The spring supplies order is in February, and I can arrange to include the millinery stock then." "Then do it," he said. "I intend to." She paused. "I wanted you to see it first." He understood what she was saying, not asking permission, wanting to share it, wanting him to see what she was doing and think it was worth doing, not because she needed his approval but because she valued his regard. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and let their fingers lace together, and they stayed like that for a while in the warm kitchen, while the fire in the other room kept the cold December night at bay. In January of 1884, George went to see Patrick Donnelly. He went on a Tuesday morning before the store opened, when he knew Elsie would be in back starting the bread she made on Tuesdays for their household, and he sat with Patrick in the small front room of the living quarters and said what he had come to say. "I would like to ask Elsie to marry me," he said. "I am asking you out of respect for you and for her, and I want to be clear that if Elsie wishes to say no, then the matter is settled by her answer and not by yours. But I believe in doing things properly, and properly means speaking to you as well." Patrick Donnelly looked at him for a long time. The old man's eyes were very bright. "You know I failed her once on this subject," Patrick said. "I know. I would not fail her again. If she did not want this, I would tell you so myself." "I understand that," George said. "But she wants this," Patrick said quietly. "I am her father and I know my daughter, and she wants this very much, though she would rather sit on a cactus than tell anyone how much she wants something before it has happened." He smiled, and it transformed his aged face for a moment into something younger. "You have my blessing, George, for whatever my blessing is worth given the record." "It is worth something," George said. "To me it is." He went to Beaumont's that day, as usual, and worked through the morning files with careful attention, and at lunchtime walked to the jeweler on the side street, a small establishment run by a man named Carson who had a case of rings that ran from the simple to the relatively ornate. George looked at them all and selected a ring that was neither showy nor too plain, a thin gold band with a small turquoise stone in a setting that was clean and strong. Elsie, he knew, preferred the practical and the genuine over the decorative and the excessive. The turquoise was the color of the Kansas sky in early morning, which seemed appropriate. That evening he went to the store at closing time as usual and helped Elsie bring in the bolt of canvas she had left outside and lock the front door. Patrick had gone to bed early, a planned early night the doctor had suggested, and they were alone in the store with the lamp burning low and the sound of the winter wind beginning outside. "Elsie," he said. She turned from where she was adjusting the bolt of canvas against the shelf. She read his face in the way she read everything, quickly and thoroughly, and something shifted in her expression. "George," she said, "I have been in love with you since a summer day in 1881 when you walked through a stockyards office and looked at everything with those sharp eyes of yours, and then turned around and left, and took a piece of my attention with you that you have never given back," he said. "I love who you are and what you do and how you think and how you manage things and how you laugh when something genuinely surprises you and how you hold everything together when things are hard and how you make notes in the margins of your ledger when you are thinking through a problem. I love all of it, every part of it, and I want to spend the rest of my life seeing more of it." He took the ring from his coat pocket. He did not go to one knee in the formal manner, not because he would not have, but because he knew Elsie well enough to know she preferred things face-to-face, eye-to-eye, without the imbalance of one person looking up and one looking down. He held the ring out. "Will you marry me?" Elsie Donnelly looked at the ring and then at his face and then at the ring again, and then she did something he had not seen her do in the whole of their reacquaintance. Her eyes filled with tears. Not falling tears, not dramatic grief. Just the kind of filling up that happens when a feeling is too large for a person's ordinary containment, and she blinked once and the composure came back but the brightness remained. "Yes," she said. "George Carson, yes." He put the ring on her finger and she held her hand out to look at it in the lamplight, and then she looked back at him and he put his arms around her, and she put hers around him, and they stood in the middle of her father's dry goods store, surrounded by bolt cloth and sacks of grain and the orderly rows of her careful inventory. And it was, George thought, exactly the right place for this to happen. They were married in March of 1884, on a Saturday when the Kansas spring was just beginning to announce itself in the form of early green grass and a sky that had finally lost the hard gray of winter. The ceremony was held in the Caldwell church, officiated by the minister, a serious man named Reverend Aldrich, who was nonetheless capable of warmth on appropriate occasions, and attended by a respectable portion of the town. Patrick Donnelly walked his daughter down the aisle with a straightness to his posture that suggested he was drawing on reserves of dignity he kept for important occasions, and Elsie walked beside him in a dress she had made herself from a cream-colored wool that she had special ordered through the store, simple and well-fitted, and exactly right for her. George stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which was genuinely his best and not just his least dusty, and watched her walk toward him, and thought that the 2 years he had spent riding away from this were the most foolish investment he had ever made. After the ceremony, Clara Pruitt's Cafe was the site of the wedding dinner, Clara having offered this as a gift with the firm stipulation that she would hear nothing more about payment. She produced a meal that the town would discuss for months afterward, roasted pork and sweet potato, and 3 different kinds of pie, and the Grange Hall fiddle player provided music, and the whole of it had the quality of something the town had been wanting to celebrate and was glad to finally have occasion for. Mrs. Hale cried, which surprised everyone including Mrs. Hale, who recovered her composure quickly and denied it. Old Tom Withers presented the couple with a carved wooden box that he had made himself, which contained, when opened, a set of 6 silver spoons that had belonged to his wife who had died in 1879, and said gruffly that silver spoons should be in a house where they would be used, and sat back down with the air of a man who had said his piece. Beaumont shook George's hand for a long time and told him, with evident sincerity, that he had the best clerk of his 40 years of practice, and he intended to raise his salary to $30 a month in the new year, which was not precisely the traditional form of wedding congratulation, but was entirely in character and genuinely appreciated. Patrick Donnelly drank a glass of whiskey, which was 1 more glass than Dr. Hargrove had sanctioned, and spent the evening looking at his daughter and his new son-in-law with an expression of quiet, complicated happiness. Elsie and George went that night to the room above the Donnelly store, which Elsie had always kept as her own room and which was now theirs, and the March wind came in around the window frames, and the town settled into its night sounds, and George Carson lay in the dark and listened to his wife breathe beside him and felt the extraordinary ordinary rightness of it. In the spring of 1884, Elsie launched the millinery section of Donnelly's dry goods with the organized efficiency of a military campaign. She had corresponded through the winter with suppliers in Kansas City and had arranged a shipment of hat forms, ribbon stock, and the better classes of felt and straw that millinery required. The widow Carmichael, whose sewing ability had been correctly assessed, came in 3 days a week to take commissions and construct custom pieces. It was, within 2 months, making money. This surprised some people in Caldwell who had expected it to be a pleasant but marginal addition. It did not surprise George. He had known what Elsie was capable of when given the resources and the latitude to use them. The summer of 1884 brought heat and a significant dry spell that worried the cattle ranchers and made the town feel smaller and more provisional in the way that extreme weather does, reminding people of the scale of the land they lived on and the tentativeness of their arrangements upon it. George spent long days in Beaumont's office, which required the window open and produced a sweat that had nothing to do with the work and everything to do with the temperature. He came home in the evenings to the rooms above the store, which Elsie had arranged with thoughtful efficiency, everything in its proper place, the kitchen producing the kind of meals that emerge from genuine cooking ability rather than mere competence. They had been married 4 months when Elsie told him, on an August evening when the heat had finally broken into a bearable coolness, that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen while she was putting the dishes away after supper, turning from the shelf with a cup in her hand, and saying, in her particular direct manner, "I believe we are going to have a baby, George. In February, I think, from what Dr. Hargrove tells me." George sat at the kitchen table and looked at his wife for a long moment, and then he stood up and crossed the room and put his arms around her carefully, as though she were suddenly very precious, which she always had been, but which the news had made more immediately apparent. She laughed at the care of his embrace and told him she was not made of glass, and he laughed too, and held her less carefully, and they stood together in the kitchen in the August evening, and the future arranged itself around them with a warm and particular fullness. Patrick Donnelly, when told, sat in his chair by the fire and pressed his lips together and looked out the window for a while, and then turned back and said, "Your mother would have liked to see this," to Elsie, and Elsie went and sat beside him and took his hand, and the three of them were quiet together for a moment in the way of people who share the same losses. The autumn of 1884 was the most contented George had ever experienced. He was good at his work, and Beaumont, who communicated appreciation through efficiency rather than sentiment, had given him increasing responsibility, including the management of 3 significant land estate cases that required the kind of careful organization George was well suited for. The millinery addition to the store continued to perform well, and Elsie, who refused to slow down until Dr. Hargrove suggested it might be sensible, ran both it and the main store with the same systematic precision she had always applied. On walks, in the early evenings when the fall light went golden across the prairie, and the cattle country smelled of grass and cooling earth, George and Elsie talked about the baby in the thoughtful and practical way that was their natural mode. Names, arrangements for the room that would need to serve as a nursery, whether the cradle in Caldwell's furniture shop was well made enough, or whether they should commission one from the carpenter who worked out of the wood shop on the edge of town, whether Elsie would be able to maintain the store through the early months with the help of the widow Carmichael, and if needed, a temporary girl from town. They talked about the future in a larger sense too. George had begun to think, with Beaumont's quiet encouragement, about whether he might one day read for the law himself. Beaumont had no formal partner and was getting older, and had mentioned twice, in the precise and deliberate manner of a man who is not quite making a direct proposal, but who wants to be understood, that a young man of George's precision and reliability might consider whether a partnership might be worth pursuing. George turned it over in his mind like a stone in his hand, feeling its weight and its angles, and talked to Elsie about it, and she listened with the full and focused attention she gave everything, and then said that she thought it was exactly the right direction, and that she had thought so since November of the previous year when she had seen how Beaumont trusted him. "You thought about it a year ago," he said. "I think about most things for a long time before I say them," she said. "You should be used to that by now." He was used to it. He loved it. Their son was born on a cold Saturday in February of 1885. Dr. Hargrove was there, and Mrs. Hale, who had turned out to have assisted at more births than anyone might have expected of a boarding house keeper, was also there, and Patrick Donnelly was downstairs in the store making tea with the concentration of a man who needs to be doing something specific and deliberate rather than standing about being worried. The birth was not easy, difficult enough that George, pacing in the hallway in a state of genuine and helpless fear, understood in his body and not just his mind how much he loved Elsie, understood it in the way that extreme circumstances compress and clarify things. But it resolved, as Dr. Hargrove had told him with professional optimism it would, and at 7:30 in the morning of that February Saturday, with light just beginning to come through the frost on the window, George was allowed into the room. Elsie was exhausted in a way he had never seen her exhausted before, the extraordinary effort of it written on her face, but she was completely herself, the sharpness in her eyes not diminished by any degree, and in her arms was a baby boy of considerable lung capacity who was expressing strong opinions about his arrival in the world. "There he is," Elsie said, and her voice was worn to its foundations, but underneath it was something warm and enormous. "Come and meet him." George sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then looked at his wife and could not speak for a moment, which was unusual and which Elsie understood because she said nothing and simply let him sit with it. "Patrick," George said finally, "if you are willing for your father." Elsie looked at him and the worn and large thing in her expression grew larger still. "Patrick James Carson," she said, trying it out. "Yes, that is his name." They named the baby Patrick James Carson. And the infant Patrick James, once he had made his opinions about the world known and been fed and been held, and had decided to temporarily suspend his objections, turned out to be a person of considerable focus and what Elsie described as an extremely evaluating stare. Patrick Donnelly, brought upstairs to meet his grandson, sat with the baby in his arms for a long time and did not say anything at all, which for Patrick was the most significant kind of communication. The spring of 1885 came in early and warm, and Caldwell woke up from a February that had been hard and long. Baby Patrick James, who was developing the focused and watchful character that his parents had perhaps predicted, was a source of continuous occupation and a kind of joy that George had not known was available. The specific joy of watching a small person begin to make sense of the world. It was also, he was honest with himself, a great deal of work, and Elsie undertook this work with the same systematic competence she applied to everything, while also managing a return to the store in March. The widow Carmichael had kept the millinery section running through the winter, and had, in fact, added 2 new suppliers and a system for taking custom orders that was, Elsie said with a thoughtfulness that contained respect, better than the system Elsie herself had set up. She told this to the widow Carmichael directly and gave her an increase in her percentage of the custom order revenue, because accurate credit where it was due was one of Elsie's firmest principles. George, meanwhile, had begun his reading for the law. Beaumont, with the systematic generosity of a mentor who recognizes good material when he sees it, had set him a course of texts beginning with Blackstone's commentaries, which lived beside George's side of the bed and was read in the early mornings before the baby made sleep irretrievable anyway. It was slow work, fit between the daily requirements of life and marriage and fatherhood, but it was steady, and George had always been better at steady than at fast. The summer of 1885 brought a range of events that kept Caldwell interesting and George, and Elsie engaged with the town in new ways. A dispute over a land boundary to the west of town became a significant case for Beaumont's practice, involving 2 ranchers of strong character and opposing certainty about where a particular survey line fell. George spent considerable hours on the case, researching the survey records and corresponding with the state land office, and when the matter was resolved through a mediated agreement that Beaumont credited largely to George's careful research, George felt a satisfaction in the work that confirmed what he had been beginning to suspect, that the law was exactly the right direction. Caldwell itself was in the process of a particular transition that was happening across much of the cattle country. The great trail drives that had defined the town's boom years were declining. The Kansas Pacific and the other railroads had moved the cattle business north and east, and the wild years of the late 1870s and very early 1880s, when the drovers had flooded in from Texas with their longhorns and their wages and their enthusiasms, were receding into something that the Caldwell Courier was already beginning to call history. The town was becoming something steadier and quieter, a genuine settled community rather than a transit point, and the people who remained were the people building something permanent. George and Elsie were among those people, which felt right. In the fall of 1885, Beaumont called George into his office and closed the door, which was unusual enough that George paid particular attention. Beaumont sat down behind his desk and folded his hands and looked at George with the expression of a man approaching a matter he has considered at length. "I am 64 years old," Beaumont said. "My eyes are not improving, and my hands are considerably worse than they were 2 years ago. I have been practicing law in this territory for 20 years, and I intend to continue for perhaps 5 more, and then I intend to retire to a house in Wichita where my daughter lives, and have someone else read the law to me and bring me my meals." He paused. "I want to offer you a formal partnership. Not yet. You are not yet qualified, but within 2 to 3 years if your reading proceeds as it has. A junior partnership, becoming an equal partnership at such time as I retire. The practice would become yours." George looked at him steadily. "That is a very generous offer." "It is a practical offer," Beaumont said, which was, for Beaumont, the same thing. "You are the best legal mind I have encountered at your stage of development in 30 years of practice. I would be a fool not to retain you by appropriate means." George said he would discuss it with Elsie, which Beaumont found entirely correct and said so. He went home that evening and told Elsie everything Beaumont had said as precisely as he could remember it, and Elsie listened in the way she listened to important things, with absolute stillness and full attention, and then she said, in a voice that was warm and certain, "Say yes, George." "You think so?" "I have thought so for a year," she said, which he had also expected. "Say yes." He said yes the next morning, and Beaumont gave a single satisfied nod, and went back to the file he had been reading, and that was how it was settled. The winter of 1885 and into 1886 was a period of deep and settled happiness that George sometimes caught himself observing from the inside with a kind of wondering gratitude, the way a man who was very cold for a long time sometimes notices warmth with more attention than those who were never cold. He was building something. He and Elsie together were building something, and it had the solid, functional character of things built with care from good materials. Patrick James, who had opinions about everything, and expressed them in an increasingly articulate fashion as language arrived in his life, was a source of constant entertainment. He had his mother's eyes and his father's disposition for careful observation, and at 13 months had developed the habit of sitting very still and watching everything in a room before deciding how to engage with it, which Elsie found entirely recognizable and George found entirely charming. Patrick the elder, Elsie's father, had his good months and his difficult ones. The heart remained unreliable, and Dr. Hargrove's visits became a regular feature of the household calendar. But in the good months, Patrick was present and engaged, managing the lighter work of the store, talking to the regular customers who had known him for years, and sitting in the back room in the evenings watching his grandson discover the world with an expression of the deepest satisfaction. The spring of 1886 brought news from the territory and from the wider world that was part of the texture of life in the cattle country. The question of the Indian Territory to the south remained a constant backdrop to life in Caldwell, which sat at the territory's border. George had learned, through Beaumont's practice and through his own reading, something about the legal complexity of the land arrangements that had created the territory and the injustices that had accompanied the broader settlement of the plains, the treaty promises made and broken, the forced relocations, the deliberate reduction of the lands and freedoms of peoples who had lived there for generations. He talked to Elsie about this, and she had her own direct and unsentimental views, that what had been done was wrong in ways that could be stated plainly, and that being on the winning side of an injustice did not make one innocent of it, but that the question of what to do with that knowledge was complicated and ongoing. It was one of the things George valued most in her, that she engaged with complicated questions rather than putting them aside, that she had opinions based on thought rather than convenience. Beaumont's practice, in 1886, was involved in a case that brought this question closer to home. A family of Cherokee descent, the Thorntons, who had settled on the Kansas side of the border a decade earlier, and established a farm that was by any measure productive and well-maintained, were facing a challenge to their land title from a speculator who had found a legal technicality in the original land grant. Beaumont had taken the case on reduced terms because he considered it the kind of case a law practice should take, and George had thrown himself into the research with the thoroughness of a man who cares about getting it right. They won. The speculator's technicality was shown to be inapplicable to the specific circumstances of the Thornton grant, and the family kept their farm. George felt this victory with an uncommon satisfaction, the kind that comes from a case where the stakes are genuinely human rather than merely procedural. In the summer of 1886, Elsie told George she was expecting their second child. She told him in the same manner as the first announcement, direct and matter-of-fact, and with the awareness that he could see clearly now that he knew her so well, that underneath the matter-of-fact surface she was deeply, quietly moved. He knew that because of the particular way she said it, standing by the kitchen window with the evening light behind her, and because she let the sentence land between them and then waited, which she only did when she wanted the other person's reaction to be unreserved. "Are you happy about it?" she asked, which she had not asked the first time when the answer had been so obviously written on his face. "I am more happy than I know how to say," he told her. "Then say it anyway," she said. "Imperfectly is fine." He said it imperfectly and at some length, and she listened with the small smile that meant she was experiencing a feeling she found almost too large for comfortable containing. And then she came and sat beside him at the kitchen table and they talked about it, the practical and the anticipatory together, as was their way. Baby Patrick James, now an assertive and mobile presence in the household, would not be an only child. This seemed, when they explained it to him in simple terms, to produce in him a considering expression that could have been enthusiasm or could have been reservation, and it was impossible to say which was, George said, very like his mother. Elsie said this was a considerable compliment, and she accepted it. The fall of 1886 and into the winter was a full season. George's reading for the law had progressed substantially, and Beaumont had begun to allow him to appear in the justice of the peace proceedings on minor matters, which was not the district court but was practice, and George took to it with the thoroughness he applied to everything. The store entered its 6th year of the millinery edition, and Elsie had expanded it twice, adding a line of ready-made women's accessories and a correspondence catalog arrangement that served women in the surrounding farms and ranches who could not easily come to town. It was, by any measure, a success, and it had given the Donnelly store a stability and a profile in the regional trade that Patrick Donnelly had not been able to achieve in his own time running it. Their second child was born in January of 1887, another boy, arriving with slightly less drama than his brother, but with a volume of initial protest that suggested he had strong feelings about the experience. They named him Thomas William Carson, the William for George's grandfather, a man George remembered fondly from his Texas childhood as someone who had known how to be kind without making a performance of it. Patrick the elder, watching Thomas William in the early weeks with the attentive delight of a grandfather who knows he is watching borrowed time, said once to George, quietly, sitting by the fire while Elsie was upstairs with the babies, "I have made some poor decisions in my life, George. I make no argument about that. But Elsie is the best thing I ever did, and you and these boys are the best thing that happened to her. So perhaps some of the accounts balance." "More than balance," George said. "You are kind," Patrick said. "You always were." Patrick Donnelly died in the spring of 1887 in April, on a warm afternoon when the store was open, and Elsie was at the counter, and he was in his chair in the back room. She found him when she went to bring him his afternoon tea, sitting still in the way that is different from sitting. Dr. Hargrove confirmed what they already knew, that his heart had simply stopped, quietly and without distress, in the way the doctor had told them it would likely go when it went. The grief was real and deep, particularly for Elsie, for whom her father had been the constant and complicated anchor of her life, even when he had failed her, and even after she had grown to be stronger than him. She cried in the way she rarely cried, not quietly or with contained dignity, but with the full weight of it in the privacy of their bedroom, and George sat with her and held her and said nothing because there was nothing to say that was the right thing to say, and the right thing was simply to be there. She managed the store the next day and every day after, because that was who she was, but she managed it with a quietness that was different from her usual quiet. And George watched her with care and made himself present and useful in all the practical ways and some of the impractical ways. And after several weeks the quietness became less absolute and the sharpness came back into her eyes and she was fully herself again, though a slightly different self. The self that has been altered by real loss and knows it. They buried Patrick Donnelly in the Caldwell cemetery next to the stone he had placed for Elsie's mother, brought from Missouri at some expense when the store had its first good year, and the minister Reverend Aldrich said good things about a man who had tried his best in circumstances that were sometimes larger than his best. The store became fully and legally Elsie's in the summer of 1887. George handled the estate proceedings through Beaumont's practice, and the paperwork confirmed what had been practically true for years. Elsie Donnelly Carson was the proprietor of Donnelly's Dry Goods and its associated millinery, and she ran it with the precision and care of someone who knows exactly what she is doing and why. Life in Caldwell in the late 1880s had settled into the patterns of a town that had made its peace with being prosperous in a quiet way rather than spectacular in a loud one. The cattle boom was history. The farmers were the permanent economy now, and the steady trade of a farming and ranching community, less dramatic than trail drive days but more reliable, kept the town's businesses healthy. George Carson, by the summer of 1888, was preparing to take his formal bar examination before the county judge, which Beaumont had arranged with the confidence of a man who knows his student is ready. George studied in the evenings at the kitchen table, with Patrick James doing his own version of studying at the other end of the table, copying letters from the McGuffey primer that Elsie had ordered for him, and Thomas William, now walking and in possession of the loud and cheerful personality of a second child who has learned from watching his quieter brother, providing a constant and energetic background presence. The examination took place in the county courthouse in late August of 1888. George rode to Wichita for 2 days, leaving with a composure he mostly felt and partly performed, and returned on the 3rd day with the results. He had passed, with what the judge described in a brief letter to Beaumont as considerable distinction. He arrived home in the late afternoon of the 3rd day to find Elsie on the porch of the building above the store, which they had expanded to include a proper sitting area with a view of the street. She had the 2 boys with her, Patrick James sitting with a book and Thomas William, engaged in a project involving several pieces of wood and an ambitious architectural vision. She saw him ride up on Samson, who was aging but still sound and still opinionated, and she read his face before he had stopped riding, and she was smiling when he dismounted. "You passed," she said. "I passed." She came down the porch steps and across the ground between them in 3 quick steps and put her arms around him, and he held her, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. "George Carson, attorney at law," she said, muffled slightly against his coat. "The first official day is tomorrow," he said. "Today I am just a man who is very glad to be home." She pulled back and looked at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tears. "You are a man who has been building something for 5 years," she said, "and now it is built. Not finished," he said, "but built. That is how the good things always are," she said. They celebrated that evening with a dinner that Elsie cooked with particular attention, roasted chicken again, which had been on the table at every significant occasion of their life together and was by now something of a private tradition. Clara Prout sent over one of her pies with her assistant and a note that said simply, "Well done, George. C. Prout." The widow Carmichael, who had become over the years a fixture in their household's daily orbit, brought the boys each a small carved toy from the wood shop. Mrs. Hale appeared at the door with a jar of preserved apricots, and the observation that she had always known George Carson would amount to something considerable, which was touching even if George was fairly certain she had not always known this. The evening was full and warm and ordinary in its particulars, and extraordinary in its totality, which was how most of the best evenings in a good life are. In the years that followed, George Carson built a genuine and respected legal practice in Caldwell, Kansas. Beaumont retired in 1890 as he had predicted, going to Wichita to live near his daughter, and the practice became George's own, with his name on the door alongside a younger man named Webb who came to Caldwell in 1891, and whom George trained with the patient thoroughness that Beaumont had once applied to him. The practice dealt with the full range of human affairs that a small but genuine community generates: land and property, estates and inheritances, contracts and disputes, and occasionally the more complex matters that required careful navigation of the law's reach and limit. George continued to take cases where the principle mattered as much as the fee. He was not wealthy by the standards of the large cities, but he was comfortable and respected, and he slept well, which he considered a better measure. Elsie's store continued to grow in its steady, deliberate way. By 1891, she had added a third section, a small but well-stocked selection of school and writing supplies, motivated in part by the establishment of the proper Caldwell schoolhouse that same year, and she had hired 2 girls to help with the counterwork, training them in the organizational system she had developed, and in the particular kind of attentive customer care that she believed was the difference between a store people returned to and one they merely visited once. She was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the more successful merchants in Caldwell, and she received this status in her characteristic manner, acknowledged, not dwelt upon, and immediately directed toward the next practical improvement. Patrick James Carson was a serious and bookish boy who showed an early interest in mathematics that his parents encouraged without pressure. Thomas William Carson was his exact complement, loud and social, and physically adventurous in a way that kept Dr. Hargrove's practice intermittently busy over the years, and his parents intermittently breathless. They were, as brothers of opposite temperament often are, deeply fond of each other and excellent companions. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary in March of 1894, Elsie and George sat on the porch of the building above the store in the early spring darkness, which had the particular quality of early spring in Kansas, cool still, but with something underneath it that was changing, something alive in the earth and the air that had not been there in February. The boys were inside, Patrick James reading and Thomas William doing whatever Thomas William did when he was theoretically ready for bed and practically still fully energized. George was 43 years old. Elsie was 32. He looked at her in the lamplight that came through the window, the long and specific knowledge of 10 years of marriage in his view of her face, all the ways she was exactly the same person she had always been and all the ways she had grown and deepened and become even more precisely herself. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. I was thinking today, she said, about the day you walked back into the store. September 1883. You looked terrible. Your coat was dusty and you had not shaved, and you stood in the doorway with this expression on your face that I could not quite read, which is unusual for you. You are generally very readable. I was not sure of my reception, he said. I know, she said. I could see that you were not sure, and I thought standing there that I had 2 choices. I could send you away and be very right about it, very justified because you had left and that was real. Or I could acknowledge that the person I had missed for 2 years was standing in my store and that I wanted, very much, to let him back in. She looked at the dark street below the porch. It was not a difficult choice. I am not sure why I was afraid of it. You were not afraid, he said. You were careful. There is a difference. She looked at him with the particular expression that she reserved for the moments when he said something she found precisely right, a brief and genuine softness around the eyes. "Yes," she said, "there is a difference." The night was quiet around them. Inside the house, Thomas William had apparently accepted the inevitability of sleep, because the sounds from his room had softened. Patrick James's lamp was still visible under his door, because Patrick James read later than he was supposed to, and both his parents knew it, and had decided on strategic ignorance. "George," Elsie said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was deciding how to say something. "Then I am going to have another baby." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the street below, and then she turned to look at him, and the expression on her face was the one he knew by now, the one that was matter-of-fact on the surface and deep as good water underneath. "February again, I think," she said. "I am very predictable." He laughed, which surprised her, and then she laughed, and they sat together on the porch in the March evening laughing about the predictability of February. And then he reached over and took her hand, and she held his hand with the firm and warm grip that was entirely hers. "Are you happy?" he asked, returning the question she had asked him 7 years before. "I'm the happiest I have known how to be," she said, "which is considerably more than I expected to be when I think about where we started." He thought about where they had started. A stockyards office in 1881. A dry goods store where she had told him there was no way out. A January morning when he had ridden north and spent 2 years being wrong about whether leaving was the same as surviving. A September afternoon when he had crested a ridge above a Kansas town, and known with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with truth, that this was where he needed to be. "I should have ridden back sooner," he said. She shook her head. "You rode back when you rode back," she said. "It was enough." Below them, the lights of Caldwell were warm in the March dark, the town settling into its evening, the saloons with their modest noise, the homes with their lamplight in the windows, the streets with their familiar shapes, the prairie beyond it all going on in the darkness, enormous and particular and entirely itself. Samson was retired now to the paddock behind the livery, too old for serious work, but too much a presence in George's life to be otherwise disposed of, and he spent his days with the leisurely satisfaction of a horse who has been places, and is content to have arrived. George went most mornings to check on him, a habit he kept without fully examining why, and the old bay horse greeted him with the reliable consistency of a companion who knows exactly who you are. On those mornings, standing at the paddock fence with Samson's large head over his shoulder, George sometimes thought about the ride south from Abilene in September of 1883. The 3 days on the road, the slow accumulation of decision that had brought him over that ridge above Caldwell, the specific quality of that afternoon light when he had first seen the town again after 2 years, the water tower, the painted letters, the familiar shape of a place he had been trying to convince himself was not home. He had not been brave, he thought. He had not been particularly noble or decisive. He had simply run out of convincing himself otherwise, and then he had pointed the horse south and ridden until he got here. Sometimes that was what love asked of you, not heroics, just the long, stubborn refusal to let the distance be the final word. He went back inside to the sounds of the morning, to Thomas Williams' enthusiastic arrival at the breakfast table and Patrick James's more measured descent, to the smell of coffee on the stove and the particular sound of Elsie's step in the kitchen, brisk and purposeful, the step of a person who knows what she is doing in the space she occupies. He sat down at the breakfast table, and Thomas William immediately told him something very important about a horse he had seen on the way to school yesterday, with the passionate attention to detail that characterized Thomas Williams' narrations of everything he found interesting, which was most things. Patrick James, with the elder sibling's resigned patience, waited for the horse story to conclude before asking his father a question about the arithmetic he had been working on, which was considerably advanced for his age, and which George answered with the straightforward engagement that he had always received and valued and intended to pass on. Elsie set the coffee in front of him, and their eyes met across the table in the brief, warm, entirely recognizable exchange of two people who know each other through and are glad of it. Their third child, a daughter they named Margaret Louise Carson, arrived in February of 1895, which was indeed February, Elsie observed, as she had predicted. Margaret Louise came into the world with the same evaluating stare that Patrick James had displayed, and within the first hours of her life had already assessed the room and its occupants and appeared to have formed preliminary conclusions. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's particular quality of careful attention, and she was, from the beginning, someone who was clearly going to have extensive opinions about everything and the capacity to articulate them thoroughly. Thomas William, at 8 years old and in possession of the enthusiastic certainty of a boy who has always gotten along with everyone, appointed himself Margaret's chief protector, an ambassador to the wider world immediately and comprehensively. Patrick James, at 9, took a more measured approach, but was observed on multiple occasions to be reading to the baby with the patient gravity of someone passing on important knowledge to a trusted associate. On the evening that Elsie came home from the store for the first time after Margaret's birth, walking carefully in the March air with the particular care of new recovery, and stepped through the door of their home to find George had gotten the boys to help him prepare a supper that was, he admitted, more effort than skill but earnestly intended. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the slightly lopsided biscuits and the soup that had clearly been stirred by someone who was not entirely sure how much stirring was ideal, and then looked at her husband and her sons standing with expressions of anticipatory hope, and she laughed in the way she very rarely laughed, freely and without any management whatsoever. "It is beautiful," she said, which was generous and true in the way that things can be true when they are said with the right understanding of what beautiful means. They ate the imperfect supper in the warm kitchen, George and Elsie and the two boys and the baby in her cradle beside the table, and the spring dark outside the windows carried the beginning of the smell of the new season, the earth waking up the way it did every year in Kansas, reliable and enormous, and not much impressed by the small affairs of people, but not entirely indifferent to them either. George Carson looked around his kitchen at the people in it, and felt something that he had no precise word for, and did not particularly need one. It was the feeling that comes when you have ridden a long and uncertain distance, and arrived at the place that was always meant to be the destination, not because the place was perfect or the road was easy, but because the people in it were exactly the people who had your name in them somewhere, who had always had your name in them, who you would have missed in the deepest way if you had not found your way here. He had spent 2 years convincing himself that leaving was the same as protecting himself. He understood now that protecting yourself from the things that matter most is the least protective thing a person can do. He had come back because she was the only reason that made sense, and she had been the reason for everything since. Outside Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1895, was a town that had made its peace with what it was and was building toward what it would become, a settled, particular, human place in the middle of the immense land that had always been larger than anyone's plans for it. The cattle drives were memory. The farmers were the fact. The families were the future. The stars above the prairie were the same stars they had always been, enormous and unconcerned and quietly beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been themselves for a very long time and have no intention of changing. And in a kitchen above a dry goods store on the main street, a man who had ridden 2 days south from Abilene on a September morning 12 years ago, because he had run out of reasons not to sat with the family he had built beside the woman who had been the only reason worth riding for, and was, in every way that counted, entirely home.